Welcome to another episode of Mindful Musicians with Nancy Schleier. And today we have on Stephanie Ycaza. She is a horn player. I know you play tuba and euphonium, I believe. And she works with students using mindfulness. So first off, tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, how you got into music, why mindfulness.
Sure. Yes. So currently I'm teaching tuba and euphonium at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And prior to that, I just started that position. So prior to that, I was living in Iowa and teaching at the University of Northern Iowa. So I came to music just through band and kind of just, there's a long history of, a story of how I came to be where I am. But the short version of that is no one really stopped me from playing tuba and euphonium. No one actively stopped me from ever doing that. So I just kept doing that until I eventually, did it enough that I got, I got my degrees. I freelanced a ton. I've taught at a bunch of different universities and played with a lot of different groups, and eventually and got that full-time position at the University of Northern Iowa. So really, I am I would call myself an artist teacher, but I'm very interested in the teaching side of things and in mindfulness as it relates to that. As a performer, I perform as a soloist, but I also am a part of a brass quintet called Calypsis Brass, which is it's an all-female brass quintet where we prioritize playing the works of composers from underrepresented groups. So that's kind of me and what I do. I came to the mindfulness thing when I was in my doctorate degree. And anybody who's ever been through grad school or really any school can probably relate to this, but I pretty much was just having a tough time, honestly. And I was looking for coping mechanisms. I was kind of in therapy, or I guess I don't know if it was therapy or a counselor at that time, but yeah, essentially I was just trying to manage my life. So I came to the mindfulness thing more by way of the mental health side of things, as opposed to, there's another part of mindfulness that comes from a more Eastern and Eastern religion approach. So I sort of came to it literally just through I attended a 6-week seminar that was available to me through my health insurance, which was actually pretty awesome. And I did that, and we went over these core principles of mindfulness in that, and it really helped me in my life and managing my life at that point. But also every single topic that we went over in that seminar, I just couldn't help but think to myself, man, this has very real applications to music, to practicing music. So at the time I was I was doing my doctorate, and I was studying with Andrew Hitz, who was my tuba professor, but you may also know him as the person who is the host of the Entrepreneurial Musician podcast. So he really pushed me to take this topic and turn it into something. And his big thing is just kind of just as he calls it, ship it, put it out into the world. And I was kind of dragging my feet on that because it's kind of personal. And I was like, man, I don't want to, but he was like, just do it. It's a blog. You can edit it later if you don't like it. So I started a blog about it on my website. And so I've kind of kept that going. Now it's turned a little bit more into a video blog than a written blog, although I do still write. And essentially that has kind of given me a bunch of different areas to research, read about. I do presentations on the topic as well. But what I really focus on with myself and my students is mindfulness in the practice room, and then, essentially the ways in which that translates to performance on the stage.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. That's kind of a similar way to how I stumbled upon mindfulness. I had a lot of mental health issues, and in college I had some severe anxiety and depression and things like that. And was taking a world religions class because I went to a super Christian university, and so they were like, do this. But we studied Buddhism, and I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. And so I kind of like stumbled on it kind of that way, but it was for the same reasons. So talk about like what kind of I guess issues do you see with students, and then maybe talk about what techniques that you teach them, because it's, I think mindfulness is great and everything. Not and I'm not trying to downplay it, but I find that there's not a lot of people who are attaching it to music, and so I'm really fascinated to hear your kind of input into that.
Yeah. Um, Well, my students kind of fall into different groups, and in my experience, and I mean, I'm putting myself in this group too because, as I often tell people, and you'll probably relate to this as well. This is not something that I research because I'm great at it. This is something that I started researching because I was the opposite of that, and I needed to get better at it. So, part of it is essentially just managing the stress response. So, a lot of students have issues with performance anxiety or things relating to that. And so some of the mindfulness things that we do they do take place in the practice room, but they also take place on stage. And the idea is to prepare ourselves while practicing to really be in the moment when we go on stage. And then the other big area of, I guess, uh, issues that some of my students struggle with is the issue of mental focus in general, and kind of how do I, in the practice room, how do I be productive? How do I stay on task and get what I want to get done when I have a million distractions and all the ways that we have our like technology monkey brain today. Um, so, the things that I use to counteract those things or to work on those issues are things that sort of come from that mindfulness playbook, that mindfulness mental health playbook. Like the core skills that we talk about from that side of things are and observation, description, participation. So there are exercises that I'll have students do that are designed to help them center themselves in the practice room, like a short meditation or breathing exercise. There are exercises that I'll have students do that is essentially to keep track of observing and describing what is happening to them when they're playing music. So this could be anything from you're going to play an etude, and then when you're done, you're going to write down all the words that came into your head while you were playing that. And then we're going to talk about whether maybe those are the words that you would use to a student of your own, or maybe if you wouldn't find those words productive with a student, how can we deal with that? So observing and describing in that sense, sometimes in a more literal sense of recording themselves and writing things down, which often proves to them that when they sort of try to observe in an objective manner, it sort of proves to them that they're maybe doing more than they thought they were. And the real skill that goes along with that is non-judgment. So we practice, okay, what happened here in a way that does not have any value judgment. So we try not to use words like good or bad. Instead, oh, I played an E flat when I meant to play an E natural, or when I was instructed to play an E natural by the sheet music or whatever. So we do things like that, and we try to translate that to the stage by practicing participation. There are these two concepts that kind of go hand in hand: participation and one mindfulness, but essentially being in the moment. So what we try to practice while we're just practicing is the same thing that we want to do on stage, which is, like, I like to think of it as when you're in Sibelius or Finale or whatever, and you push playback, there's this cursor that goes across the screen, and try to imagine ourselves as that cursor. I'm not really thinking about the note that I missed in the past. I'm not thinking too much about the note that I might miss in the future. I'm trying to stay in the moment, stay engaged, participate in the present moment. And so I think that, the number one question that I usually get when I do presentations about this is, well, how do I apply, what do I do when I'm on stage if this is what I do in the practice room? And my answer is usually, well, we're going to try to do the same thing. We're going to try to be mindful and engaged in the practice room, but it's also in service of being mindful and engaged on stage so that you can fully be able to collaborate with others, be in the moment, react to the moment, hey, possibly even enjoy the moment that you are performing. So yeah, those are some of the things that I end up doing, but a lot of it is just, everybody's different. Each student is an individual. I'm an individual. We all have kind of um, our own individual responses to whatever kind of stress or something that may happen in the practice room or on stage.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's amazing. Um, so you kind of talked about, I'm sorry, my brain just like went a billion different places. It's like, I'm like trying to like bring it back. So you mentioned, there was something you mentioned and I was like, I can't think of it now. So hopefully I'll think about it in a minute. So when you are working with students and they are working towards a performance, it, I don't know, for me, like there's something almost like electric about a performance that you don't get in a practice room. What kind of things do you do to help the students prepare for that? And work through that kind of as they hit it?
Well, I do a fair amount of like recording has traditionally, or maybe in the last 20 years or so, kind of been the answer for how you can simulate performance conditions. Of course, my students have opportunities to play for each other. We have a weekly rep class. I do a lot of recording projects myself, like in my office. So I usually have a mic set up, and they don't love seeing that when they come in, but like we will sometimes record and react to that. Another thing that I do personally that I have recommended to my students, and I am not 100% sure if any of them have taken me up on this, but right now the way that I'm doing that for myself is Instagram Live, because if you throw on Instagram Live, anybody could stop by, maybe nobody, but I'll tell you, if you have that thing facing you and you see somebody pop up in there, like that will trigger your response. The reason why we're doing that is not like I personally don't like the idea of like, oh, I'm just going to do this so many times. What's the thing? I can't remember the term of like X therapy or whatever, where you just like throw yourself, immersion style into it, and you're just like, okay, I hate spiders, so I'm going to cover myself in spiders. Like, no, I um, that's not really that's not really what I'm going for. What I'm going for is, okay, what happens to you? And I talk with my students after this, after they perform or after they record. What happened to you while you were doing that? Okay, I started sweating, my heart rate sped up, I got dry mouth, my leg was shaking. The physical response or the mental response. My negative self-talk was going. I was focusing on a million different things and I couldn't get my brain where I wanted it to go. Or the emotional response of just, whatever, feeling a certain way, feeling terrible while doing that. And then essentially we just try to come up with a plan to deal with that in performance. So you cannot you cannot always exactly capture that, and you do want to try to see what you can do to maybe simulate it. But the main thing is walking out on stage already knowing what's likely going to happen to me and what am I going to do about it. So when that thought comes up in my head about, oh my gosh, the high note is coming up, or whatever, what am I going to replace that thought with? I'm going to, so sometimes we'll talk about like a mantra of, okay, every time something like that happens, I just say to myself, all right, back to the present or back to the moment or something like that. So we sort of talk about different strategies for that. And I have some students that don't struggle with that at all. And in that case, I try to not talk about it at all. I'm like, okay, great. Let's not discuss this at all. You're doing great. But what I find, and maybe you have found this as well, is there's a correlation between this type of thing, between overthinkers, analytical brain, and essentially it's like your greatest strength is often the other side of the coin is your greatest weakness. So if you struggle with overthinking and being in that negative space when you're performing, then chances are you are a pretty analytical person, and that really helps you in the practice room. It probably helps you be a good teacher as well. And you kind of have to accept the bad with the good. And like I said, just come up with a plan for it. My students that don't struggle with performance anxiety or anything like that, often what we find ourselves talking about is more the other side of things, how to be analytical in the practice room and how to engage with your practice and learn a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. It's interesting that there's like that, you've noticed that separation. So that definitely makes sense. I also notice, and I don't know if you notice this with your students, but I tend to notice that the students who are a little bit more emotionally sensitive also tend to have more of that performance anxiety, and they tend to have more of that self-doubt and that negative self-talk and things like that. So, what advice would you give to students who are actively having those maybe negative feelings, or what we might label as negative feelings? I don't know if they are, but
Mm-hmm.
those things we would inhibit us from being our most effective performers.
Well, first of all, feelings are not bad. Feelings are our friends. And honestly, what you're saying about emotionally sensitive people, I'm not sure that you can be an effective musician if you can't at least a little bit access your emotions. Like the other side of that is a world where everything is extremely logical and I don't have access to my emotions. If I can't do that, then I can't read a room. I can't react to another person. I can't react to music. So first of all, it isn't it isn't ultimately a negative thing. It is an asset. And so when you have those negative feelings, like, what my practice of mindfulness tells us is to, acknowledge them, to feel it, and then to move on. So there's a couple of visualizations that we use, like envision yourself that you're sitting on top of a very high up hill and your thoughts are coming along like the cars of a train, and then you see it and you see that one that says that I'm terrible, and but then you just see it go off around the bend into the distance and then it's gone, or like clouds in the sky just floating by and you're kind of just like, oh, there it is, okay, well, there it goes. So the first part of that is acknowledging it and just being like, yeah, that's what I'm feeling. A lot of our pain and anxiety comes from us trying to resist feeling things because we do not want to feel them. So the first step toward moving past that is to acknowledge it and then hopefully let it float by, and or try to actively kind of remind yourself, replace it with another feeling or thought, like, okay, now I'm going back to the present. So like there's, when you find yourself in that state, that's where the whole observation and description thing comes into play. Like there's an exercise in mindfulness where you will do a task, like a mundane task like making coffee, and you're supposed to narrate every step of the way. So you're supposed to be in your head describing everything as it happens. I'm taking the mug down from the cabinet. I'm putting the mug on the counter. I'm filling the coffee maker with water. I'm putting the coffee filter in. You do this thing where you have no choice but to be in the present moment because you're the narrator. And sometimes in performance, you can do that as well. And Noah Kageyama of the Bulletproof Musician blog and podcast, he talks about this quite a bit, where gymnasts, for example, will have like an entire mental choreography to go along with their physical choreography, because they know that thoughts and feelings might arise. So they plan it out, everything. They plan, this is, I'm going to think this when I'm doing this. I think this when I'm doing this. And musicians can be, I mean, there's a lot that we as musicians like could be learning from athletes in sports that we are just not. But the Bulletproof Musician's a great resource for that, since that's his area of study. But yeah, essentially a lot of it I think comes from, I shouldn't feel this way. I don't want to feel this way. This feels bad. And once you realize, to a certain extent, everybody's feeling this way. It's normal. It's what happens. It's what happens to us. And by the way, if it didn't happen, then that means you don't care. And that doesn't create a good performance either. So there are some really, there are some interesting studies out there about the stress response in athletes that suggest that people who have zero stress response do not perform better than people who have a stress response. And it's because you care, because the stakes are there, your mental focus is engaged. So it just means that you're human, but try to narrate, try to be as objective as possible. Being non-judgmental is like, that's just a lifelong, task that all of us are trying to do and failing every day. It's a very human thing, but recognizing it and narrating it, and also understanding that there is another side to that coin that is a strength for you. And if you want that strength, then you also have to accept, these issues that come along with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that you brought up the gymnastics and the sports side. I remember years ago, I had a student who had really severe performance anxiety, and I was trying to help her get through it. And so I was researching it, and I read a study that gymnasts and I think it was baseball players, they studied them, and they said when they go to like hit the ball, they don't imagine hitting the ball. They imagine the ball going over the fence. They're like, they already imagine success before they ever hit the ball. They're like, and the author came back and he was like, but we as musicians, we don't imagine already having played or sang that note. We're like, oh my gosh, this high note is coming up, or oh my gosh, the hard part is coming. And we freeze up instead of just like working through that and being like, it's going to happen. Just let it happen. So that's really fascinating that you like that up.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's very true. And I mean, there's that whole sort of inner game of tennis thing about that, where like athletes are, I also heard somebody say in a master class like once about gymnasts again, gymnasts don't practice slow either, because they can't. They can only practice like their little elements, but almost everything they do is actually already the performance. Whereas I think just for us, it's just the percentage of time spent alone practicing these minute details is so large compared to the time spent performing, that like it is very tough to kind of get into that mode. And we're so used to receiving criticism that sometimes we don't imagine, the beautiful note coming out, because we can't, because we haven't allowed ourselves to maybe think that that's a possibility. So, I think vocalists are really interesting people to talk to about this, because they already know from a young age that their voice is not going to mature until a certain point. So they kind of already know that until you reach a certain age, all of it is just sort of a work in progress. Yet as instrumentalists, we kind of don't give ourselves that. We don't give ourselves that sort of caveat to what we're doing. We just are, I'm listening to these recordings and I'm not that, so I must be terrible kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to kind of like watch, listen to like, for me, I listen to a lot of pianists and things because I'm a pianist. That makes sense. But a lot of times people who have been playing 40, 50, and 60 years will go back and talk about that. And they'll talk about, how how when they were younger, how they didn't understand this or this or this, and then as they've grown, as they've gotten older, as they've performed more, as they played more, they'll talk about how they've grown as a musician. And that for me has always been really, one, kind of frustrating, because then I'm like, well, now I have to wait for 50, 60 years before I can do that. But also it can be kind of a good thing, because then it can kind of help us remember that it is a process.
Exactly. And like that, there's something sort of comforting to me in the fact, like, some of my reading has been the book like Mindfulness by Ellen Langer, and a lot of the stuff that she's written is interesting because she was like a psychology professor who was studying this stuff. And one of the things that she says, like her angle on studying mindfulness is, one of her angles is studying the roots of the opposite of mindfulness, which is mindlessness. And what she says is, if you view things as this sort of trajectory, like we do that as musicians, we're like, okay, I start here and then my journey is here. And so that this is like a straight line. I go from here to here. And then there's just like nothing after this. Is like, I guess I'm done with that forever. Whereas it is more of a process, and probably a cyclical process. And if you ask any of those people that you're talking about, like, if it was a fixed result, then at some point, one of us somewhere should have said, I'm done. I did it. I did music. It's over. Like, I accomplished it. But no one will ever say that, because that isn't how any of us feel. That's not how the most, well-renowned performers in the world feel. So like, it is simply a process, and it's probably cyclical, and viewing it as, a fixed beginning point and end point really limits your mindset, makes your mindset constricted, which is another definition of, mindlessness, is having your mindset very fixed and rigid and not being able to change it.
That, yeah, I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much for being on today. Is there anything that you want to kind of like leave listeners with? Any kind of thoughts that you have, or?
Yeah, one last thing I'll say. I was giving a presentation on this I think this was when I was giving the presentation for the International Women's Brass Conference online. I was talking about mindfulness in the practice room, and someone asked a question at the end and was just basically like, well, I don't know how to, I just feel like I'm in the practice room and like I just get, I can't be productive all the time. Eventually I have to stop, and like, I find myself just like scrolling on my phone. I don't know how to like maintain that productivity 100% of the time when I'm practicing. And what I said after thinking, and what I think all of us should really think about, is like, well, you can't really do that. Like, we're not a machine. We need to take it easy on ourselves. You're not going to be productive 100% of the time that you are awake every day. So we need to kind of take it easy on ourselves. And hey, maybe after 30 minutes of practicing, of mindful practicing, which is difficult, maybe 5 minutes scrolling your phone is an appropriate reward for you. And, admitting that you're human is not, in any of these things, is not bad. It's just you embracing who you are. And like, we also need to take it easy on ourselves, give ourselves rewards, and kind of help ourselves in that way as well, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic advice. I remember in college, I had a professor who he showed me a study where it said your peak performance is, or like you can perform at your peak for about 45 minutes. And then from there, the quality of whatever you do drops off drastically. And he was like, give yourself a few minutes break after 45 minutes to refresh, and then it restarts that 45 minutes. So I think that's so great. It also like goes back into like just being kind to yourself, being thoughtful about yourself, things like that. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to everybody. So this has been Stephanie Ycaza. Did I say your name correctly?
Yes.
Her Instagram is
Ycaza.
Yes, Ycaza. And then her her website is stephanieycaza.com. So check her out. Check out her blog. She's fantastic. I listened to one of your blog posts right before our meeting today, so it was awesome. But thank you so much, and everybody have a great day.